They asked me why I didn't just leave, why I stayed with a man who researched how to hurt a pregnant woman without killing her on Google, why I counted every punch instead of fighting back. Here's what they don't understand. I wasn't weak. I was strategic. And that strategy plus 20 FBI agents watching my worst night unfold put my abuser behind bars for 65 years. This isn't a story about being a victim. It's about survival, broken systems, and the moment everything exploded. If you've ever been judged for your choices, drop a comment. Your story matters too. Let's start at the beginning with a dinner party invitation. I should have refused. 47, 48, 49. I'm counting my husband's punches. Not because I'm scared, though I am. Not because I'm surprised, though this is worse than usual. I'm counting because the woman standing in my kitchen doorway, the one my husband introduced as his new boss 3 hours ago, just pulled out an FBI badge. And I need to remember every detail for what comes next. 50. His fist connects with my ribs. The baby kicks frantically inside me. 8 months of life trying to survive her father's rage. 51 and on, I taste copper and blood. Let me back up. My name is Sloan Harper. 4 years ago, I married a man I thought I knew. 6 months ago, everything I believed about my life turned out to be a lie. Tonight, that lie is being beaten out of me in my own living room while a federal agent watches through the kitchen door, her hand hovering over her weapon, waiting for the exact right moment to intervene. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. That's what trauma does. It scrambles time, makes everything happen at once, even though it took years to build to this moment. 52, 53, 54. This morning, I woke up thinking today would be ordinary. My husband Brett kissed me goodbye before leaving for work. I spent the day preparing for the dinner party he insisted we host. His new regional director was coming over. He'd said, someone important, someone who could make or break his career. I should have known something was wrong. Brett had been acting strange for weeks, more controlling than usual, checking my phone constantly, asking who I'd talked to, where I'd been. Last week, he grabbed my wrist so hard it left bruises when I mentioned wanting to call my sister Lindsay. You don't need to bother her, he'd said, his grip tightening. She's busy with her own life. Why do you always have to be so needy? I'd learned not to argue. 4 years of marriage had taught me that arguing made things worse. 55, my cheekbone cracks, stars explode across my vision. The dinner had started well. Brett's boss, a woman named Diane Russo, arrived with a man she introduced as her husband Mark. She was 40-something, confident, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything. The kind of woman I used to be before I gave up managing the gallery in Chicago. Before Brett convinced me that moving to Denver for his promotion was the right choice, before I became just a housewife counting the days until the baby arrived, Diane kept asking questions during dinner. Personal questions. How long had Brett and I been married? Did I work? Did I have family nearby? Brett's hand kept finding my knee under the table, squeezing too hard. A warning. Then it happened. I was clearing the dessert plates when I knocked over Brett's expensive whiskey decanter, the one his father gave him, the one he'd told me never to touch. It shattered on the kitchen floor, amber liquid spreading like blood across the tile. You stupid, clumsy. Brett's hand was around my throat before I could apologize. He slammed me against the counter, his face inches from mine. Do you have any idea how much that cost? How embarrassing you are. Diane and Mark were in the living room. They couldn't see. I could hear Diane's voice asking if everything was okay. Brett's grip loosened enough for me to gasp out, I'm fine, just clumsy. The baby makes me so uncoordinated. The lie came automatically. I'd been telling versions of it for 2 years. After they left, I thought I was safe. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. 56, 57, 58. 20 minutes after Diane Russo left our house, Brett started pacing, back and forth across the living room, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. I knew that walk. I'd learned to recognize it the same way animals recognize the approach of a predator. What did you say to her? His voice was quiet. That was worse than yelling. The quiet meant calculation, not impulse. I was on the couch, my hands protectively over my pregnant belly. I didn't say anything. Brett, we just talked about normal dinner party things. She asked about the business, about our finances, about how often I travel. He stopped pacing and turned to face me. Why would she ask those questions unless someone gave her a reason to be suspicious? I don't know. Maybe that's just what bosses do when they're getting to know their employees. Wrong answer. I saw it in his eyes before he moved. His hand cracked across my face, not the punch yet, the warm-up. You smiled at her wrong, he hissed. You looked at her like you wanted to tell her something, like you wanted to embarrass me in front of the person who controls my career. Brett, I didn't. You've been acting weird for weeks. Looking at your phone, being secretive. Are you talking to someone, your sister, that friend Jenna, who keeps trying to interfere in our marriage? The accusations were familiar. They never made sense, but they didn't have to. Brett didn't need a real reason, he just needed an excuse. I tried to leave once, 2 years ago, before I got pregnant. I'd packed a bag and made it as far as my car. Brett had found me in the driveway. He'd cried, actually cried. Told me he was sorry, that work stress was making him crazy, that he'd get help. He'd shown me brochures for therapists, made appointments he never kept, bought me my grandmother's pearl necklace from an estate sale, the one I'd mentioned once in passing. I'd stayed, not because I believed him, but because leaving seemed more dangerous than staying, because he'd whispered in my ear that night, his hand gentle on my face, if you ever try to leave me, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of wife you really are. Unstable, emotional, the kind of woman who makes things up for attention. I'd believed him. When you're isolated, when someone controls your money and your friendships and your sense of reality, you believe things that would sound insane to anyone else. Then I got pregnant, and I thought, stupidly, hopefully, that maybe the baby would change him, that becoming a father would make him want to be better. Instead, it made him worse. It made, you're trapped now, he'd said once. His hand on my pregnant belly, not loving, possessive. You can't leave when there's a baby. Courts favor mothers, but they also don't like women who break up families. You'll stay because you have no choice. He was right, or so I thought. Now, tonight, he was standing over me with that look in his eyes, the one that meant the real violence was coming. Not the slap, the punches. You embarrassed me, he said. Each word was precise. In front of my boss, in my own home, you broke my father's decanter. You smiled at her like you wanted her to know I can't control my own wife. Brett, please, the baby. The baby is exactly why you're going to learn this lesson. Because you're not going anywhere. Not now, not ever. The first punch caught me in the ribs. I curled instinctively, protecting my stomach. Years of this had taught me the only defense that mattered. That's when I started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The numbers kept me focused, kept me from screaming, from fighting back, from doing anything that would make it worse. Each punch was data. Each impact was evidence. If I survived to tell someone about it, 6, 7, 8, 9, no, 10, I'd been to the emergency room 4 times in 2 years, 4 different hospitals, 4 different sets of lies. I fell down the stairs. I walked into a door. I'm so clumsy when I'm pregnant. The nurses had looked at me with knowing eyes, had given me pamphlets about domestic violence resources, had asked the mandatory, are you safe at home questions. I'd lied every time, because telling the truth meant Brett would know I'd talked, and that would make everything worse. 20, 21, 22. My face was wet, blood or tears. I couldn't tell. The baby was still kicking. That was good. That meant she was alive. That meant I just had to survive long enough for this to end. 31, 32, 33. And that's when the doorbell rang. Brett froze, his fist raised for punch number 34. We both heard it. 3 sharp knocks, followed by the doorbell. Then Diane Russo's voice from outside. Brett, your phone's been buzzing. Todd's trying to reach you. Something about an emergency with the Prescott account. Brett's expression shifted from rage to panic to calculation in the space of 3 seconds. He looked down at me, bleeding on our cream-colored carpet, looked at the door, looked back at me. Stay here, he whispered. Don't make a sound. If you embarrass me again, I'll finish this later. He straightened his shirt, ran a hand through his hair, and walked to the door. I could hear him arranging his face into something normal, something pleasant, the mask he showed the world, through the ringing in my ears. I heard the door open. Diane, is everything okay? Brett's voice was concerned. Professional. Not at all like the voice that had been calling me worthless 30 seconds ago. I tried calling, but you didn't answer. Todd really needs to talk to you about... Diane's voice cut off abruptly. There was a pause. Then, sharper, Brett, why is there blood on your hand? What? Oh, this Sloan broke a glass earlier. I was helping clean up and cut myself. It's nothing. Another pause. Longer this time. When Diane spoke again, her voice had changed. It was harder, more authoritative. Step aside, Brett. Excuse me. Step aside. They say, now. I heard footsteps. Diane pushed past Brett and into the house. She found me in the living room, still curled on the floor, my hands over my belly, blood on my face and the carpet. Our eyes met. In that moment, something passed between us. Recognition, understanding, the way one woman knows another woman's secret just by looking. Call 911, Diane said, not taking her eyes off me. Now, Brett, this is my house. You can't just... Call 911 or I will. Diane knelt beside me, her movements careful. Sloan, can you hear me? Are you hurt anywhere besides your face? I couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. Brett's boss was on the floor with me. Brett's boss was helping me. Brett's boss was supposed to be impressed by him, supposed to help his career, supposed to be part of his perfect professional image. Brett, I strongly suggest you step back. Diane's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath. This is none of your business. This is between me and my wife. Actually, Diane said, reaching into her jacket pocket. It is my business. She pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. A gold badge caught the light. FBI Special Agent Diane Russo, you're under arrest. The world tilted sideways. FBI. Agent. Under arrest. Brett's face went white, then red, then something I'd never seen before. Fear. What? This is insane. You can't. This is entrapment. You set me up. I didn't make you assault your pregnant wife. Brett, you did that all by yourself. Diane was pulling out her phone now, calling for backup. And for the record, I've been investigating you for 8 months. Money laundering, pharmaceutical theft, fraud. But this, she gestured at me, still bleeding on the floor. This is going to make my case a lot easier. You're lying. You're not FBI. This is a setup. Diane stood up, positioning herself between Brett and me. Backup is 2 minutes away. You can either sit down and wait quietly, or we can add resisting arrest to your charges. Your choice. Brett looked at the door. I could see him calculating. Could he run? Could he talk his way out? Could he convince everyone this was a misunderstanding? Then his eyes found mine, and in that moment I saw something I'd never seen before. Not the rage, not the control, genuine, absolute fear. He knew it was over. Sloan, he said, his voice changing to the one he used after previous beatings, the apologetic one, the one that promised it would never happen again. Baby, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. The stress, the pressure at work. I would never save it. Diane cut him off. I heard enough through the door before I knocked. You're done. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Car doors slammed. Heavy boots on the front walk. 3 more FBI agents came through the door, weapons drawn. Brett Donovan, one of them said. Put your hands behind your head. Brett complied. Mechanical, his eyes still on me. You'll never survive without me, he said quietly. You'll never make it alone. They cuffed him, read him his rights, let him out of the house while I watched from the floor, my hands still on my belly, counting the baby's kicks now instead of punches. Diane knelt beside me again. Sloan, I'm so sorry we couldn't prevent this. We've been building a case against Brett for months. We suspected he was violent based on financial control patterns, but we didn't have proof until tonight. You let this happen, I whispered. The words felt thick in my mouth. You knew and you let him. We suspected, we didn't know, and we couldn't arrest him without evidence. I'm sorry. Paramedics rushed in. They were asking questions. How many weeks pregnant are you? Where does it hurt? Can you move your arms? Can you tell me your name? I answered mechanically. 34 weeks, everywhere. Yes, Sloan Harper. We're transporting you to Memorial Hospital, one of them said, gentle but efficient. Your baby needs to be checked. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, I caught Diane's eye. How many? I asked. How many what? Punches. How many did you see? Diane's expression was unreadable. I got here at 33, but I could hear it starting when I was walking back to my car. I'd estimate you were at around 20 by the time I realized what was happening and came back. So she'd heard 20 punches before coming back, had chosen her moment carefully, had gathered enough evidence before intervening. I'd counted 33 more after that, before Brett stopped. The math was simple. The truth was devastating. 53 punches while an FBI agent listened outside my door, waiting for the right moment to save me. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital was bright. Too bright. Fluorescent lights that made my head pound, worse than it already was. They'd given me something for the pain, but it wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough for what I was feeling. A doctor named Patricia Sullivan examined me with practiced efficiency. Gentle hands, kind eyes, the kind of professionalism that comes from seeing too much suffering. Fractured cheekbone, she said, not looking away from my face. 2 broken ribs, severe bruising across your torso and back. Mild concussion. She paused. Sloan, how far along did you say you were? 34 weeks. We need to monitor the baby closely. The trauma you experienced could trigger early labor or cause placental abruption. You're going to be here for at least 48 hours. I nodded, numb. My hand hadn't left my belly since Brett's arrest. The baby was still kicking. Strong and insistent kicks that said she was still fighting too. Dr. Sullivan pulled up a chair, sat down to be at eye level. This isn't the first time you've been in an emergency room with suspicious injuries, is it? I said nothing. I have your medical records here. 3 visits in the past 2 years, different hospitals each time. She read from her tablet. 18 months ago, laceration requiring stitches. You said you fell downstairs. 12 months ago, severe abdominal trauma. You said car accident. 6 months ago, dislocated shoulder. You said you tripped over your dog. She looked up. Sloan, you're there. You don't have a dog. I forgot which story I told, I whispered. The confession felt like failure. You told the story you needed to tell to survive. That's not a failure, that's strategy. Dr. Sullivan's voice was firm. But now you need to tell the truth. Not to me, to yourself. What happened tonight has been happening for years. Hasn't it? The words unlocked something. Maybe it was the pain medication. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the simple fact that Brett was in jail and couldn't hurt me for talking. He wasn't always like this, I heard myself say. When we met, he was charming, attentive. He cried at our wedding, promised to protect me forever. I believed him. When did it start? 6 months after we got married. A push, then a slap, then worse. He'd apologize after, buy me things, cry and say he'd change. And I'd believe him because I needed to believe him. Because admitting I'd married a monster felt impossible. Why didn't you leave? The question everyone asks. The question that makes sense to people who've never been trapped. Because leaving is when he'd kill me, I said simply. Statistics say the most dangerous time for an abused woman is when she tries to leave. Brett told me that once, whispered it in my ear like a threat. You leave, I'll find you. And it'll be worse than anything you can imagine. Dr. Sullivan nodded like she'd heard this story 1,000 times, because she probably had. Then I got pregnant, and I thought maybe the baby would change him. Instead, it made him worse. He said I was trapped now, that courts don't like women who break up families, that I'd stay because I had no choice. But you do have a choice now. Brett is in federal custody. Agent Russo told me the charges are serious. He won't make bail. I wanted to believe her, wanted to feel safe, but 4 years of conditioning told me that safety was temporary, that Brett always found a way to regain control. What if he gets out? The question came out small, childlike. Then the FBI and the police and everyone in this hospital will make sure you're protected. But protection is just a word. I'd learned that the hard way. A nurse came in to adjust my IV. "Mrs. Donovan, you have visitors. A woman named Jenna Caldwell. She says she's your friend." "Let her in," I said, then corrected myself. "And it's Harper. My name is Sloan Harper, not Donovan." Taking back my name felt like a first step toward taking back myself. Jenna burst through the door like a hurricane. My college roommate, the friend Brett had systematically pushed out of my life over the past 4 years. We'd barely spoken in months. "Oh my God," she breathed, taking in my face, the monitors, the hospital gown. "Sloan, I saw it on the news. They said FBI raid, domestic violence, pharmaceutical theft. I drove straight here." She grabbed my hand, careful of the IV. Her eyes were red. "I'm so sorry, Miss Yaman," she said. "I knew something was wrong. I could see it. The way you'd cancel plans last minute. How you stopped posting on social media. The way you'd flinch when your phone rang. I should have done more." "You couldn't have." He made sure I was isolated. Made sure I thought I had no one. I squeezed her hand. "But you're here now. I'm not leaving. You're staying with me when they release you." No arguments. For the first time since the assault, I felt something other than pain and fear. Hope, small, fragile, barely there. But present. Agent Russo came by an hour later, still in her FBI jacket, official and intimidating in a way that felt protective now instead of threatening. "How are you feeling?" she asked, like I was beaten by someone I loved while the FBI listened outside my door. I said, and was surprised by the bitterness in my voice. Diane winced. "You have every right to be angry. We gambled that Brett would crack under pressure, that inviting him to dinner with a federal agent would make him show his true self. We were right, but that doesn't make what happened okay. Why didn't you stop him sooner? Because if I'd stopped him after the first punch, his lawyers would argue provocation, temporary insanity, that he wasn't really dangerous. Now we have evidence of sustained, calculated violence. 53 documented strikes. That's attempted murder. Sloan, that's a life sentence. Unless he makes bail." Diane hesitated. Just a moment, just enough to make my stomach drop. "His family is wealthy. His mother is already hiring expensive lawyers. There will be a bail hearing tomorrow. I won't lie to you. There's a chance he'll get out. The system isn't perfect." I closed my eyes. I'd thought the worst was over. I'd thought being in the hospital with FBI protection meant safety. I was wrong again. 48 hours later, I sat in a wheelchair in a courthouse hallway, my face still swollen, my ribs wrapped, 8 months pregnant and terrified. Brett's bail hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning. Agent Russo had warned me it would be fast, procedural, probably in my favor. Brett had assaulted a pregnant woman in front of a federal agent. No judge in their right mind would grant bail. She was wrong. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. Brett's attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Nathan Clark, argued 3 points. First offense for domestic violence. Substantial ties to the community. Pregnant wife means flight risk is low. "Your Honor," Clark said smoothly, "my client is a respected pharmaceutical sales executive with no prior criminal record. Yes, there was an unfortunate incident fueled by work stress and an FBI agent's provocative presence in his home. But Mr. Donovan is not a danger to society. He's a father-to-be who needs treatment, not incarceration." The prosecutor, Rachel Zimmerman, argued back. "Your Honor, Agent Russo documented 53 distinct strikes. The defendant fractured his wife's cheekbone, broke 2 ribs, and nearly caused premature labor. This isn't a minor domestic dispute. This is attempted murder." But Clark had done his homework. He presented character witnesses. Brett's boss, Todd, who testified that Brett was a model employee. Brett's mother, who cried on the stand about her son's good character. A therapist Brett had apparently been seeing, who said he was making progress. I wanted to scream. The therapist was new. The character witnesses had never seen Brett at home. His mother had called me 2 days ago, threatened to destroy me if I didn't drop the charges. Judge Morrison, an older man with tired eyes, listened to both sides, looked at Brett, clean-shaven and remorseful in a suit, looked at me, swollen and scared in a wheelchair, and granted bail, $500,000, ankle monitor. Restraining order, no contact with me or witnesses. But bail. Brett's mother wrote the check immediately, had it ready, like they'd planned for this. I watched Brett walk out of the courthouse a free man, watched him glance at me as he passed, his expression, his expression unreadable. Watched the door close behind him. Then I broke down. Jenna held me in the courthouse bathroom while I sobbed. Agent Russo stood outside, making calls, her voice clipped and angry. "This is wrong," Jenna said. "How can they let him out? You're in a wheelchair. You're 8 months pregnant." "The system isn't built to protect women like me," I said, my voice hollow. "It's built to give men like Brett second chances." Rachel Zimmerman found us 20 minutes later. The prosecutor looked as angry as I felt. "I'm sorry, Sloan. The judge prioritized Brett's rights over your safety. But this isn't over. The criminal trial is in 6 weeks. Federal charges for the pharmaceutical theft are separate. We're going to make sure he goes to prison." 6 weeks, I repeated. "I'm due in 2 weeks. You're telling me I have to give birth while my abuser is free, wearing an ankle monitor and living 10 miles away." Rachel had no answer for that. That night in Jenna's guest room, my water broke. The contractions started at 2 in the morning. Not the gentle practice ones I'd been feeling for weeks. Real, grinding pain that took my breath away. "It's too early, I gasped, clutching Jenna's arm. "I'm only 34 weeks. We're going to the hospital now." Jenna was already grabbing her keys, calling ahead to Memorial. The drive was a blur of pain and fear. Not fear of childbirth. Fear that something would go wrong. Fear that the stress and trauma had hurt my baby. Fear that Brett would somehow find out, would somehow show up even with the restraining order. Dr. Sullivan was waiting when we arrived. They rushed me into a delivery room, hooked me up to monitors. The baby's heartbeat was fast but steady. "The assault triggered early labor," Dr. Sullivan explained. "Your body went through severe trauma. Sometimes that's enough to start the process. We're going to try to slow it down, give the baby more time." But my body had other plans. 6 hours later, after labor that felt like being torn apart from the inside, my daughter was born. 4 pounds, 2 ounces, tiny and perfect, and screaming with lungs that worked despite being 6 weeks early. They put her on my chest for 30 seconds before whisking her away to the NICU. "She needs help breathing," a nurse explained. "Her lungs aren't fully developed, but she's strong. She's a fighter." Like her mother, I thought. I named her Hope, because that's what she represented. Hope that something good could come from something terrible. Hope that I could break the cycle of violence. Hope that we could both survive. The next 3 days were a fog of recovery and NICU visits. Hope was in an incubator, breathing with help from a machine, too small and fragile to hold for long, but alive, fighting. Jenna brought me clothes, food, magazines I couldn't focus on. Agent Russo visited daily with updates I didn't want to hear. "Brett filed paperwork today," she said on day 3. "He's petitioning for paternity rights. Wants to be listed on the birth certificate." I stared at her. "You're kidding." "His lawyer is arguing that despite the assault charges, he has legal rights as the father. He wants supervised visitation in the NICU." The room spun. "He tried to kill us, and now he wants to visit her. Family court is separate from criminal court. Different judges, different standards. It's complicated." "Uncomplicated. Tell me he can't touch my daughter." Diane looked uncomfortable. "I can't promise that, but we're fighting it. Rachel is arguing that Brett's documented threats and violence make him a danger to Hope. We'll present evidence from his phone, his computer. We found things. Sloan, really bad things." "What kind of things?" "Journal entries, Google searches, text messages to friends. Brett wasn't just violent. He was planning to use Hope to control you. He researched how to use custody battles to keep women trapped. How to make you look unstable in court. How to," she stopped, choosing her words carefully. "How to hurt a pregnant woman without killing her." The room went cold. "He researched it," I said slowly. "The assault wasn't rage, it was calculated." "Yes, which makes it worse legally, but better for us in court. Premeditation, intent. We can prove he's not just an abuser. He's a predator who plans his attacks. I thought about all the times Brett had hurt me, how he always seemed to know exactly where to hit to cause maximum pain without visible damage, how he'd learned to avoid my face until that last night, how he'd whispered statistics about domestic violence like threats. He'd been researching the whole time, studying how to control me, how to hurt me, how to get away with it. There's more, Diane said. The pharmaceutical theft case. It's bigger than we thought. Brett wasn't just stealing drugs. He was part of a ring that was diluting cancer medications and selling them to desperate patients. What? 17 patients died over the past 2 years. We can link their deaths directly to the diluted medications Brett and his partners sold. He's facing federal manslaughter charges, multiple counts. If convicted, he's looking at 65 years minimum. 65 years. My daughter would be a grown woman before Brett got out of prison, but only if he was convicted. Only if the trial went the way it should. Only if the system that had already let him make bail didn't fail us again. There's going to be media coverage, Diane warned. Brett's attorney is already talking to reporters, trying to control the narrative, claiming FBI overreach, entrapment, that we used you as bait. Because you did. Diane flinched but didn't deny it. We suspected Brett was violent. We didn't know for certain. We made a calculated decision to put surveillance on him while investigating the pharmaceutical theft. When I heard the assault starting, I called for backup and intervened as quickly as I could. You waited. You heard 20 punches before you came back. Yes, and I'll have to live with that decision. But Sloan, if I'd stopped him at punch number 1, his lawyers would have argued provocation, temporary insanity, that it was a one-time incident. Now we have documented evidence of sustained, calculated violence. That's the difference between Brett getting probation and Brett getting life in prison. I understood the logic. Hated it, but understood it. I need to see my daughter, I said. In the NICU, Hope was sleeping in her incubator, so tiny, so innocent, so unaware that her father had tried to kill her before she was born. A nurse named Margaret helped me sit in the rocking chair, then carefully placed Hope in my arms for the first time since birth. 4 pounds of warmth and life and possibility. She's going to be okay, Margaret said. Her lungs are getting stronger every day. Another week, maybe 2, and she can go home. Home? I didn't have a home. Jenna's apartment was temporary. The house I'd shared with Brett was a crime scene. I had no job, no income, no plan beyond survival. But I had hope, and hope was enough. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I knew better than to open it, but I did anyway. A picture of my sister Lindsay. At work, at her office in Seattle, someone had been watching her, following her, photographing her. The message below the photo was simple. Protective orders work both ways. You talk, she pays. My hands shook. Brett couldn't contact me directly because of the restraining order, but he had people, friends, family, someone willing to stalk my sister to send me a message. I showed the text to Agent Russo. She took my phone, her jaw tight. We'll trace this, figure out who sent it, file additional charges against Brett for witness intimidation. Can you protect Lindsay? We'll contact Seattle police, put surveillance on her. But, Sloan, I need you to understand something. Brett is escalating because he's desperate. The pharmaceutical case is solid. The assault charges are solid. He knows he's going to prison. People like him don't go quietly. What are you saying? I'm saying be careful. Stay with Jenna. Don't go anywhere alone. And trust that we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. But safety was an illusion. I'd learned that lesson 53 punches ago. The first catastrophe came 5 days after Hope was born. I was in the NICU holding my daughter when the contractions started again. Not labor. Something worse. Stabbing pain in my abdomen that made me gasp and nearly drop Hope. Margaret took the baby quickly. What's wrong? I don't know. It hurts. Something's wrong. They rushed me to an exam room. Dr. Sullivan appeared within minutes, her face grave. You have an infection, likely from the stress your body underwent during the assault and premature delivery. We need to start aggressive antibiotics immediately. Will it affect Hope? I've been breastfeeding. You'll need to stop for now. We'll get her formula. Your health has to come first. But my health coming first felt like failure. Like I couldn't even do this one thing right. The infection meant 3 more days in the hospital, 3 days away from hope, 3 days of fever and antibiotics and feeling my body betray me one more time. Jenna stayed with me. Brought updates about hope, photos, tiny clothes she'd bought that our daughter couldn't wear yet because she was too small. She's getting stronger, Jenna assured me. She gained 2 ounces. That's huge for a preemie, but I couldn't shake the guilt. Couldn't stop thinking that the infection was my fault. That if I'd left Brett sooner, if I'd been stronger, if I'd done something different, none of this would have happened. Dr. Sullivan sat me down on day 2 of antibiotics. Sloan, I need you to listen to me. None of this is your fault. Not the assault, not the premature birth, not the infection. You survived something horrific. Your body is doing the best it can. I should have left him years ago. When he told you he'd kill you if you left, when he isolated you from your friends and family, when he controlled all the money, when he threatened everyone you loved. Dr. Sullivan's voice was fierce. You stayed alive. That's not weakness. That's strategy. And now you're fighting to heal. That's courage. I wanted to believe her. Wanted to stop feeling like everything was my fault. The second catastrophe came when I was finally discharged from the hospital. Brett's attorney filed an emergency custody petition. I found out from Rachel Zimmerman, who called Jenna's apartment where I was recovering. Sloan, I need you to sit down for this. I was already sitting, but I gripped the armrest harder. Brett's attorney filed paperwork claiming you're mentally unstable due to postpartum depression. They're arguing that the assault charges are exaggerated, that you're not fit to care for Hope, and that Brett should have temporary custody pending the criminal trial. The room tilted. You're kidding. I wish I was. There's a family court hearing in 3 days. They're arguing that Brett is a first-time offender who deserves a chance to be a father, and that your mental state makes you a danger to the baby. I have a broken cheekbone and 2 broken ribs from him beating me. How am I the danger? Family court judges look at different factors than criminal court judges. Brett's attorney is arguing that the assault was a one-time incident, that he's in therapy, that he wants to be part of Hope's life. He tried to kill us. I know. And we're going to fight this with everything we have. But Sloan, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that the judge might grant supervised visitation. No, the word came out flat, final. He doesn't get to touch her. He doesn't get to call himself her father. He lost that right when he counted out 53 punches while I tried to protect her. We'll make that argument. We'll present the journal entries, the Google searches, the evidence of premeditation. But family court is unpredictable. The hearing was everything I'd feared. Brett sat across the courtroom in a suit, clean-shaven, remorseful expression, perfectly crafted. His attorney painted him as a man who'd made one terrible mistake under enormous pressure. Your Honor, Mr. Donovan has already completed 2 weeks of intensive therapy. He's wearing an ankle monitor. He's complying with every requirement of his bail. He's a father who wants to meet his daughter, to be part of her life. That's not a crime. Rachel presented our evidence, the medical records, the police reports, the FBI documentation of 53 punches, but the family court judge, a woman named Stevens, seemed unmoved. I understand the assault charges are serious, Judge Stevens said, but Mr. Donovan has parental rights. This court's job is to determine what's in the best interest of the child, and research shows children benefit from having both parents involved. I stood up. Rachel tried to stop me, but I didn't care about protocol. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Stevens looked surprised but nodded. Brett Donovan researched how to hurt a pregnant woman without killing her. He documented his plans to use our daughter to control me. He texted friends saying pregnancy would trap me. After he was arrested, someone sent me photos of my sister with a threat that if I testified, she'd pay. That's not a father. That's a predator. The courtroom was silent. And you're asking me to let him have supervised visitation, to let him hold my 4-pound baby, to give him any access to the child he tried to kill before she was born. Judge Stevens studied me for a long moment. Mrs. Harper, I understand your fear, but absent a conviction, I can't terminate parental rights based on pending charges. However, given the severity of the allegations, I'm going to require additional safeguards. She ruled that Brett could have supervised visitation once Hope was released from the NICU, 2 hours per week, with a court-appointed supervisor present, no overnight visits, no unsupervised contact. It wasn't what I wanted, but it was better than nothing. The third catastrophe came that night. Agent Russo showed up at Jenna's apartment at 10 p.m. with news I didn't want to hear. "We've completed our investigation into the pharmaceutical theft ring," she said without preamble. "It's worse than we thought." How can it be worse than 17 people dying? Because Brett wasn't working alone. He had partners, 3 other pharmaceutical sales reps, 2 distributors, and someone inside the FDA approving the diluted medications. The entire network was bringing in over $5 million a year. $5 million. While I'd been living on an allowance Brett gave me, he'd been stealing millions. "There's more," Diane continued. "Some of the patients who died were parents, children, young adults. The diluted cancer medications didn't just fail to help them. In some cases, the additives Brett's partners used were toxic. They made people sicker faster." "You're telling me Brett is a murderer?" "Yes. Multiple counts of manslaughter at minimum. Possibly second-degree murder, depending on what we can prove about intent." "That's good. That means he goes to prison forever, right?" Diane hesitated. "It means he's desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. His attorney is arguing FBI overreach, entrapment, that we used you as bait to strengthen our case." "Because you did?" "Yes, and that's going to be a problem." Diane sat down, looking more tired than I'd ever seen her. "The media is picking up the story. Brett's attorney is giving interviews, claiming you're a willing participant in an FBI sting, that you exaggerated the abuse to help our case, that the whole thing is a setup to take down an innocent man." "Innocent? He beat me unconscious." "I know, but Nathan Clark is good at his job. He's already planted doubts. Some outlets are running stories questioning whether the FBI went too far, whether we should have intervened sooner, whether we put you in danger to build our case." "Did you too?" Diane met my eyes. "Yes, and I'm sorry, but I do it again, because now we have evidence to put Brett away for the rest of his life. The question is whether the jury will see it that way, or whether they'll believe Clark's version where you're a victim of FBI manipulation." I thought about that, about being beaten 53 times while an FBI agent listened outside, about Hope being born premature because of the assault, about having to fight for custody of my own daughter. "When's the trial?" I asked. 4 weeks. They're expediting because of the media coverage and because Brett's out on bail. The judge wants this resolved quickly. 4 weeks to prepare. 4 weeks to relive the worst night of my life in front of strangers. 4 weeks until Brett either went to prison forever or went free. And Hope would be in the middle of it all. The federal courthouse was a fortress. Security checkpoints, metal detectors, armed guards everywhere. I'd been here before for the bail hearing and the custody hearing, but this was different. This was the criminal trial. This was where Brett would finally face consequences, or where he'd walk free. Hope was 6 weeks old now, out of the NICU and living with me at Jenna's apartment. Still tiny at 5 pounds, but healthy, strong, a fighter, like the nurses kept saying. I'd had to leave her with Jenna to come to court. The thought of being separated from her even for a day made my chest tight with panic. But Rachel Zimmerman had been clear babies in courtrooms don't play well with juries. They cry, they distract, they make people uncomfortable. So I'd kissed Hope's forehead that morning and promised I'd be back soon. Promised I was going to make sure her father never hurt either of us again. The courtroom was packed. Media in the back rows, sketch artists since cameras weren't allowed, spectators who'd been drawn by the sensational headlines. I recognized some faces: Brett's mother, his brother, friends from his work, all there to support him. On my side, Jenna, my sister Lindsay, who'd flown in from Seattle, and Agent Russo, a small army against Brett's battalion. Brett sat at the defense table in a suit, his ankle monitor hidden under expensive slacks. He looked thin, stressed, but not broken. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he smiled. Small, cold, a reminder that he still thought he could win. Judge Morrison presided again, the same judge who'd granted bail, the same judge who'd seemed sympathetic to Brett during that hearing. Jury selection had taken 2 days. 12 people, strangers who would decide if the man who'd beaten me unconscious should go to prison or go free. 7 women, 5 men, mostly middle-aged, mostly white. I'd watched them file in, tried to read their faces, tried to figure out which ones would believe me. Rachel Zimmerman stood for opening statements. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about 2 things: premeditated violence and calculated greed. Brett Donovan didn't just assault his pregnant wife. He researched how to do it. He planned it. He documented his intent to use their unborn child as a weapon of control. And while he was doing that, he was part of a criminal enterprise that stole and diluted life-saving cancer medications, leading to the deaths of 17 innocent people. She laid out the case methodically. The pharmaceutical theft ring, the $5 million, the fake medications, the deaths, then the assault, 53 documented punches, medical evidence, FBI testimony. This is not a man who made a mistake, Rachel concluded. This is a man who made choices, calculated, deliberate, criminal choices, and it's time for him to face the consequences. Nathan Clark stood for the defense, smooth, confident, every inch the expensive lawyer. This is a case about FBI overreach, he began, about an agency so determined to make a big bust that they put an innocent woman in danger. Yes, Brett Donovan made a terrible mistake that night, but it wasn't premeditated. It was a man breaking under the pressure of being illegally surveilled, of having federal agents invade his home, of watching his life fall apart. He painted Brett as a victim of stress, of the FBI, of a wife who didn't understand the pressure he was under. The FBI knew Brett was under extreme stress. They suspected he might be violent, and instead of warning his wife, instead of protecting her, they used her as bait. They let Agent Russo witness an assault that could have killed both Sloan Harper and her unborn child. Why? Because it made their case stronger. Clark looked at the jury, his expression grave. Ask yourselves, what kind of law enforcement agency does that? What kind of people let a pregnant woman get beaten to make their investigation look better? The real criminals here aren't sitting at the defense table. They're sitting in the gallery, wearing FBI badges. It was a good argument. I could see some jurors nodding, could see doubt creeping in. The prosecution's case took 3 days. Agent Russo testified first, calm, professional, explaining the 8-month investigation into Brett's pharmaceutical theft activities, how they'd moved her into position as his new regional director, how she'd been invited to dinner, how she'd heard the assault starting. Why didn't you intervene immediately? Clark asked on cross-examination. I called for backup as soon as I realized what was happening. I returned to the house as quickly as I could, but you heard at least 20 punches before you knocked on the door. Yes. That's 20 punches you could have prevented by warning Mrs. Harper that her husband was under investigation, that you suspected he might be violent. If we'd warned her, Bush, we would have compromised the investigation. Brett would have known we were watching. So you chose the investigation over her safety. Diane's jaw tightened. We made a judgment call that resulted in a fractured cheekbone, 2 broken ribs, and a premature birth. Was it worth it? Objection, Rachel said. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the question. The medical examiner testified next, explaining the injuries in clinical detail. The fractured cheekbone, the broken ribs, the bruising pattern consistent with repeated strikes, the evidence of blunt force trauma. Then came the victims' families from the pharmaceutical case. 17 people whose loved ones had died after taking Brett's diluted cancer medications. Mothers, fathers, siblings, children. Each one told their story. Each one looked at Brett with hatred and grief. One woman whose teenage daughter had died spoke directly to him. You killed my baby, she said, her voice breaking. You took her medicine and replaced it with a poison because you wanted money. I hope you rot in prison forever. Brett looked down at the table, wouldn't meet her eyes. On day 4, I testified. Walking to the witness stand felt like walking through water. Heavy, slow, every step an effort. The courtroom was silent except for my footsteps and the rustling of people shifting in their seats. I'd practiced this. Rachel had prepared me, told me what questions to expect, how to stay calm, how to stick to facts, not emotions. But sitting in the witness box, looking at Brett across the room, all that preparation felt useless. Rachel started with the basics. How long had I been married to Brett? When did the abuse start? Had I ever reported it before I answered mechanically? 4 years married. The abuse started 6 months in. No, I never reported it because Brett had convinced me no one would believe me. Tell the jury what happened on the night of September 22nd, Rachel said gently. I took a breath. Brett's new boss came for dinner, Agent Russo, though I didn't know she was FBI at the time. After they left, Brett was angry. He said I'd embarrassed him. He started hitting me. Where did he hit you? Everywhere, my face, my ribs, my back. I curled up to protect my stomach, to protect the baby. How many times did he hit you? I counted 53 before Agent Russo came back. She said she heard more before that. The final count was 53 documented punches. A juror in the front row gasped. An older woman, grandmother aged. She was looking at Brett with disgust. Why did you count? Rachel asked. Because I knew that if I survived, someone would ask me exactly what happened. I needed to remember. I needed evidence. What were you thinking while he was hitting you? That I was going to die, that my baby was going to die, that no one was coming to help. But someone did come, Agent Russo. After 53 punches, after I thought I was going to die, Rachel nodded, let that sit with the jury, then asked, did you know the FBI was investigating your husband? No, if I'd known, I would have left. I would have protected myself and my baby. Were you working with the FBI as some kind of informant or bait? No, I didn't even know Agent Russo was FBI until she arrested Brett. I thought she was just his boss. Rachel showed the jury photos of my injuries, my swollen face, the bruises, the medical reports. Then she showed them Brett's journal entries. Mrs. Harper, did you know your husband was documenting his plans to control you? No. Did you know he researched how to hurt a pregnant woman without killing her? Not until after he was arrested. Rachel read some of the journal entries aloud. The jury listened, faces hardening. Then it was Nathan Clark's turn. He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, approached with measured steps. Mrs. Harper, you testified you never reported the abuse before this incident. Why not? Because I was scared. Because Brett threatened me. But you had opportunities. You went to emergency rooms 4 times. Doctors asked if you were safe. You lied to them. Because telling the truth felt more dangerous than lying. Or because there wasn't much to tell, because the incidents were minor and you're exaggerating now to help the FBI's case. Objection, Rachel said. Badgering. Sustained. Rephrase. Mr. Clark. Clark smiled. Not friendly. Mrs. Harper, isn't it true that the FBI convinced you to testify against your husband in exchange for protection and financial support? No, the FBI documented what Brett did. I'm just telling the truth. The truth as you remember it, after significant trauma, after premature delivery of your daughter, after weeks of FBI agents telling you what happened. Isn't it possible your memory is compromised? I looked at the jury. I counted 53 punches. I remember each one. That's not compromised memory. That's survival. Clark tried several more angles, suggested I was mentally unstable, suggested I'd provoked Brett, suggested I was exaggerating to get custody of Hope. I answered each question the same way, calmly, truthfully, without emotion. When he finally finished, I was exhausted. But I'd done it. I'd told my story. The jury had heard the truth. The pharmaceutical victims testified next. Expert witnesses explained the chemistry of the diluted medications. FBI agents presented evidence of the $5 million Brett and his partners had stolen. The defense called their witnesses. Character witnesses who said Brett was a good man. The therapist who said he was making progress. Brett's mother, who cried on the stand about how the FBI had destroyed her son's life. Then Brett testified. He took the stand in his suit, looking humble and remorseful. Answered his attorney's questions with just the right amount of emotion. I made a terrible mistake, he said, his voice breaking. I love my wife. I love my daughter. I was under enormous stress, being investigated by the FBI without knowing why. When Sloan laughed that night, something in me snapped. I'm not making excuses. What I did was wrong, but I'm not the monster they're making me out to be. He talked about wanting therapy, wanting to be a better person, wanting to be a father to Hope. It was a good performance. I could see some jurors softening. Then Rachel stood for cross-examination. Mr. Donovan, you testified you love your wife and daughter. Is that correct? Yes. Then can you explain these journal entries? She held up the documents. The ones where you wrote, and I quote, "Pregnancy keeps wives trapped. She won't leave now." Brett's expression flickered. That was taken out of context. What's the context for researching how to hurt pregnant woman without killing her? That's your search history from 6 months ago. I was curious. It doesn't mean anything. Curious about how to assault your pregnant wife without killing her. That's your defense. Brett had no answer. Rachel hammered him for an hour. Every inconsistency, every labouillant, every documented piece of evidence that contradicted his testimony. By the end, he looked smaller, less confident. Closing arguments came next. Rachel was devastating. Brett Donovan is a calculating predator who planned his crimes and documented his violence. He stole from dying patients. He beat his pregnant wife while counting on her silence. He researched, planned, and executed both sets of crimes with precision. The only reason we're here today is because the FBI caught him. The only reason Sloan Harper is alive is because Agent Russo intervened. Don't let Brett Donovan manipulate you the way he manipulated his victims. Hold him accountable. Nathan Clark tried, argued FBI overreach, argued Brett deserved a second chance, argued the pharmaceutical charges were overblown. But I could see it in the jury's faces. They'd made up their minds. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. On count 1, wire fraud guilty. On count 2, racketeering guilty. On count 3 through 19, manslaughter guilty. On count 20, aggravated assault guilty. On count 21, attempted murder guilty. Guilty. On all counts. Brett's face went white. His mother sobbed. His attorney started talking about appeals. Judge Morrison set sentencing for 2 weeks later. I sat in that courtroom, holding Jenna's hand, and felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years. Safe. They sentenced Brett to 65 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility for 45 years. He'd be 90 when he got out, if he lived that long. The family court immediately terminated his parental rights. Hope would never have to know him, never have to call him father, never have to carry his name or his legacy. That was a year ago. Now I'm standing in front of a room full of domestic violence survivors. Hope playing quietly with toys in the back where Jenna is watching her. I'm a guest speaker at a fundraiser, telling my story, not for sympathy, for education. People ask me why I stayed. I say to the audience, they ask why I didn't leave sooner, didn't report the abuse, didn't fight back. And I used to feel guilty about those questions, like I'd failed by not being the perfect victim who escapes immediately. I pause, looking at the faces in the audience. I see recognition in many of them. Women who've lived versions of my story. But here's what I learned. There's no perfect way to survive abuse. You do what you have to do to stay alive. Sometimes that means staying. Sometimes that means counting punches so you have evidence later. Sometimes that means lying to doctors and friends because telling the truth feels more dangerous. Hope laughs in the back of the room. The sound makes me smile. I survived Brett not by being strong, but by being strategic, by documenting my own assault even as it was happening, by trusting that someone would eventually help, even when help felt impossible. I talk about the FBI, about Diane Russo's complicated role, about how the system both saved me and failed me. Agent Russo made a choice to prioritize building a case over my immediate safety. That choice haunts her. But it also put Brett in prison for life. Was it the right choice? I don't know. But it's the reality of how broken our systems are for protecting abuse victims. After the speech, women approach me, share their stories, ask for advice. One young woman, maybe 25, has bruises barely covered by makeup. How did you find the courage, she asks. I think about that, about counting punches, about surviving, about hope. I didn't find courage, I tell her honestly. Courage found me through a friend who called the FBI, through an agent who came back when she heard violence, through the simple fact of being seen by witnesses who couldn't ignore what was happening. I give her resource cards, hotline numbers, shelter information, Agent Russo's direct line. You can leave, I tell her. It won't be easy. It will be the hardest thing you ever do, but you can survive. I did, and so can you. She takes the cards, tears in her eyes. I don't know if she'll use them. But I've planted a seed. Later, at home in my new apartment, I rock Hope to sleep. She's 14 months now, walking, talking, thriving. She looks like me. Thankfully, no trace of Brett in her face. My phone buzzes. A text from Diane Russo. Brett filed another appeal. Same arguments. It'll get denied. But wanted you to know. I look at Hope, sleeping peacefully in my arms. Brett can file all the appeals he wants. He can try every legal maneuver. It won't change the facts. Won't change the 53 documented punches. Won't change the 17 people who died because of his greed. Won't change the jury's verdict or the judge's sentence. He's in prison. I'm free. I text back. Thanks for letting me know. We're good here. And we are good. Not perfect. I still flinch at raised voices, still have nightmares, still go to therapy twice a week to process the trauma. But I'm managing an art gallery again. Hope is in daycare, making friends, learning to be a person in a world without violence. I'm taking online business classes, building a future that doesn't depend on anyone but me. Lindsay visits next month. Jenna is still my closest friend. Diane checks in regularly. Part mentor, part guilty conscience, part genuine friend. I'm building a life, a real life, one where I make my own choices, control my own money, come and go as I please. One where Hope will grow up knowing her mother as strong, not because she never fell, but because she got back up. I carry Hope to her crib, tuck her in with the blanket Jenna made. She stirs but doesn't wake. We made it, I whisper. We survived, and now we're going to live. Tomorrow I have a meeting with a publisher about writing a book, my story, but also a resource guide for abuse survivors. Practical advice about leaving, about navigating the legal system, about rebuilding. Tomorrow I'm meeting with a lawyer about suing the FBI for their role in letting the assault happen. Not for money, for accountability, for making sure what happened to me leads to better protocols for protecting witnesses. Tomorrow I'm living a life I couldn't have imagined 4 years ago. A life without fear, without counting punches, without calculating how to survive each day. Brett thought he'd trap me, thought pregnancy and marriage and violence would keep me forever. He was wrong. I counted 87 punches. I survived, and I'm still here, still fighting, still building something better from the ruins he tried to leave behind. That's victory. That's justice. That's hope.